Have all members voted? Have all members voted?
On Wednesday night, Republicans in the Texas State House passed a controversial new election map.
88 ayes and 52 nays. House Bill 4 is finally passed.
That vote gets Texas one step closer to creating 5 new congressional districts that lean heavily red. It was not a straightforward process. You might have heard a few weeks back about the Texas Democrats who left the state. They were trying to stop a vote from even happening.
These Texas legislators ain't fleeing. These Texas legislators are fighting.
Yeah. Right.
They are fighting corruption. They are fighting racism, and they are fighting rigging.
You may have also heard about Texas Governor Greg Abbott, a Republican, threatening those Democratic lawmakers with lawsuits and arrests.
These Democrats, because they broke quorum, have tied the hands of the state to be able to address the needs of our fellow Texans. Our fellow Texans are angry at these Democrats for not showing up and doing their job.
But those Democratic lawmakers came back. The vote happened, and now 2 things are true. In 2026, when Americans turn out to vote in midterm elections, it'll be that much easier for Republicans to hold on to their majority in the House. Or it won't be, because Democrats are trying to do the same thing in the states where they're in control. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Ava Wallace, in for Elahe Izadi. It's Thursday, August 21st. Today, I talked to Post Politics reporter Maeve Reston about the race to redistrict. Maeve explains how we got here in Texas and how states like California are punching back. Maeve, thank you so much for joining us. So catch us up. How did this redistricting fight in Texas actually begin?
So it started with President Trump saying that he wanted Texas to find more seats.
And I won Texas. I got the highest vote in the history of Texas, as you probably know. And we are entitled to 5 more seats.
I don't know.
This was in an interview with CNBC. The 2026 election, which is the midterms, is not looking particularly great for him. First of all, just because of historical patterns, often the opposition party is able to net a lot more seats at this time in a presidency, but also because, there is a lot of concern about the economy, and there also is some concern about the immigration tactics that President Trump has been using. And so he really felt it was necessary to lean on the Texas governor, Greg Abbott, and Texas GOP lawmakers to say, look, you've got an opportunity to redraw the maps, even though it's mid-cycle, and this normally happens after the census that's done every 10 years. And that's how it all got started.
Okay, this might be a super basic question, but what's wrong with this new map, and why do Democrats hate it so much?
Well, basically, the maps were drawn by Texas GOP lawmakers to yield 5 more seats in Congress for the GOP. And so they have drawn, members into completely new districts that add a lot more Republicans. They have split up communities of color. As one Texas lawmaker was saying, these maps are cracking and packing the districts to stack them against Democrats. And it's just effectively what we call a partisan gerrymander. But what ended up happening is that Texas Republicans were delayed in trying to pass these maps for 2 weeks by Democrats who fled the state to prevent the GOP from having enough members present to conduct legislative business.
Maeve, just quickly, you said that Democrats were saying that this map was gerrymandered. What is the difference between gerrymandering and, standard redistricting?
Yeah, so gerrymandering means essentially that you are manipulating the boundaries of an electoral constituency to favor one party or class. So, that could be that you're manipulating the lines that break up a city with common interests, or you are doing other things that split communities of interest, and that you're doing all of that essentially to serve partisan interests.
And redistricting is just like the neutral, we're just redrawing the lines here.
Yes.
Thank you for explaining that. Okay, so back to the map. Maeve, you said that Texas Democrats fled the state to keep the legislature from achieving a quorum, from having enough members present to conduct business. Democrats are pretty outnumbered in the Texas legislature, so them coming back would certainly mean that the map would get voted through. So why did they come back at all?
Basically, Texas legislators couldn't stay away forever from home. The Democrats knew they were not going to ultimately win this one. And of course, they had been threatened in lots of different ways by the GOP officials in Texas. The other factor here was that California Democrats had unveiled their plan to counteract the Texas map by redrawing their own lines. Those new maps in California would essentially wipe out the gains that the Texas GOP was trying to make with their maps. Democrats in California are aiming to give their party as many as 5 additional seats under these new maps. And so that essentially allowed Texas Democrats to go back knowing that California was going to very swiftly take that action. So they came back.
I see. I definitely want to come back and unpack all of the kind of counter moves by California. But first, I'm wondering, what was the experience of these Texas Democrats when they did return to the state? I know our colleague Molly Hennessy-Fisk talked with State Representative Suleiman Lilani.
Yeah, so he and most of the other Democrats have been under constant surveillance by the Texas Department of Public Safety, officers that have been tracking them since their return, ostensibly making sure that they did not flee the state again. And Lilani told Molly that, this is a pure form of bullying. And he also, said basically that this is not freedom.
So, Doctor, how does it work now? Where are we going, and where is your DPS officer?
So I have my freedom paper and I am able to go wherever I need to, but I have this DPS who is following me. So I'm actually not free to do things. It's kind of intimidating that they want to follow us. It's also waste of state resources that these DPS officers who have actual job to find criminals and do other things.
Yeah, I saw these incredible videos that Molly took while driving around with him, just talking about the symbolism of the surveillance, what it all means.
So this is him behind you in the gray truck.
I believe so.
So do you have to drive differently knowing he's back there?
No, I'm just behaving trying to behave my normal self, because I don't think I've done anything wrong. And that's what we're doing. And this actually is more for the people, for the public, for you to know that what they're showing the might is, if we can do this to your elected officials, we can come do it to you. So you just follow what we tell you, otherwise your safety, your security, your life, your freedom at the stake.
And then another state representative, Nicole Collier, she declined to remain in custody of DPS officers and instead chose to sleep on the House floor for 2 nights. And it was really interesting. I was on a Democratic National Committee call with other reporters this week where Collier had joined that call. It also included California Governor Gavin Newsom and New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, who is also a Democrat. And in the middle of an answer that the Democratic National Committee chairman, Ken Martin, was giving to a reporter, Collier interrupted and said,
"Sorry, I have to leave. They said it's a felony for me to do this. Apparently, I can't be on the floor or in the bathroom."
She had told us earlier in the call that she was being confined to a bathroom to join this call with the Democratic National Committee. And we could hear someone in the background, and she said,
"Well, you told me I was only allowed to be here in the bathroom. No, hang on. Bye, everybody. I've got to go."
It was unclear exactly who was giving her that information and what piece of the law they were talking about. I mean, often there are rules in every state legislature about what kinds of political things you can do in a place like the state capitol. But of course, she was not leaving the Capitol at that moment. And so she was told that she could make this call from the bathroom. But then apparently they decided that that was not appropriate. She very hurriedly rushed off the call. Senator Booker then spoke about how outrageous it was to experience that moment in real time. And he said,
"Hey, that is outrageous. And first of all, let me tell you something. Representative Collier in the bathroom has more dignity than Donald Trump in the Oval Office. There you go. That is outrageous. What they're trying to do right there is silence an American leader, silence a black woman. And that is outrageous. And I hope everybody took note of that. The fact that she can't even let her voice be heard is freaking outrageous. Yes. And this is what we're fighting for here. This is ultimately what this is about. What we just witnessed, them trying to shut her down and say it's illegal for her to be in the bathroom and on this call.
Wow, that is more intense than I was expecting, being confined to a bathroom. That's quite a lot. Okay, I want to return to the map. What happens now that the Texas House has passed it? Is there more? Are we waiting for litigation? Is there any other kind of hoops that they have to jump through, or what now?
There will definitely be litigation, and it's unclear how that will go. Lawmakers in California are actually watching that very closely because, as we will talk about in a moment, their new maps will not go forward unless the Texas GOP-leaning maps end up prevailing not only, in the legislature and being adopted, but also in the courts. So we're going to have to see how that process plays out. But if the courts, for example, were to find that these maps do not comply with the Voting Rights Act, then they could be tossed out. And, Texas potentially could have to start from scratch. And I don't know what all the legislative timelines are, but there are certain rules about getting maps in place, a certain amount of time before the 2026 elections. So we'd have to see how that all plays out.
What is it about these maps that could be out of compliance with the Voting Rights Act? Or, what could the legal challenges look like to these maps and to maps in other states?
So we could see all kinds of legal challenges to the maps in Texas, as well as California and other states. That has happened over and over again because a lot of times what the courts are looking at, in particular the Supreme Court has looked at, is, whether maps comply with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And what the Voting Rights Act protects is that the drawing of the congressional districts has to protect communities of color, and that you can't, it's called crack or pack the maps in order to limit the influence of those communities. And that is what we will see play out in the courts. There could be other kinds of challenges, on transparency or, giving the voters enough time to digest and learn about these maps that were being put into law. So it could be a maze of court battles over the next year or so.
Pending litigation, then, I guess, how do these maps theoretically change kind of the party calculus for the midterms?
Well, so until this whole redistricting fight erupted, it seemed likely that Democrats had the upper hand and could flip enough seats to take control of the House. A Democratic House majority could impede the president's agenda, and it would give Democrats the ability to launch investigations into his administration. So a lot would change very fast. And of course, that is why President Trump is trying to guard against that possibility with every tool that he has.
Okay, so all that said, this Republican plan to make it harder for Democrats to flip the House might not actually work, right? Because Maeve, you mentioned earlier that Democratic lawmakers in states, including California, are responding with their own redrawn district maps. We're going to get into what those efforts look like right after the break. Maeve, you're in California. That's one of the states that's starting to clear some of the hurdles that they need to get through to do their own redistricting, but doing so in favor of the Democrats. So what does that look like in California, and how is it kind of different from how it might be in Texas?
So In California, Democrats have a supermajority. And so in full control of the legislature, on Tuesday, they began clearing these procedural hurdles to move forward with a redistricting plan. And it's a bit complicated, but the proposal would ask the voters to amend the state constitution and set aside these current maps, which were drawn by an independent redistricting committee, if another state like Texas or Florida changes its map to favor the GOP in the 2026 elections. And the Independent Redistricting Committee, I just should note, was something that was very popular in California and was approved by voters actually in two earlier ballot measures in 2008 and 2010. So what the Democrats are arguing is that this new map that leans toward their party would only be in effect for 2026, 2028, and 2030. And after that point, the independent redistricting panel would go back to their normal work of drawing lines, which will be done after the 2030 census. And so those maps would be used beginning in 2031. So the Democrats are saying this is temporary. We love the independent redistricting commission too, but we have to make this change because of what they've framed as Trump's power grab here.
It's not good enough to just hold hands, have a candlelight vigil, and talk about the way the world should be. We have got to recognize the cards that have been dealt, and we have got to meet fire with fire.
Governor Newsom has argued that these maps will completely neuter and neutralize what is happening in Texas. And he also has really emphasized this trigger in the ballot measure, saying that these new maps will only go into place if, these other states like Texas and Florida have approved their maps and those maps are going forward.
This does not go forward, I want to remind everybody, unless one of these other states move forward. There's still an exit ramp, not just Texas, but Missouri, as I mentioned, or Florida, Indiana, and these other states that are considering doing the unprecedented, rigging their elections with midterm redistricting.
It became clearer in legislative hearings this week that, for example, if the courts were to throw out the Texas maps, then California could revert to its old maps. So that's how they're making the argument, with Governor Newsom repeating this phrase that there's still an exit ramp.
Maeve, why is there such a difference in the way these states are able to kind of go about redrawing these lines? If I have you right, so California can do something essentially that's reactionary and it's temporary, but all Governor Abbott needed in Texas was to call an emergency session. Why is there such a difference in the way those states, or maybe those two parties, kind of approach something like redistricting?
So it really shows the power of the voters here in California, who put this independent redistricting commission into place through ballot measures because they wanted a fairer process. They got behind the idea that there should be competition in these congressional districts. And that has been sort of a bedrock principle for the Democratic Party. So it's just become this really interesting debate where Democrats now have kind of flipped the position that they previously have had, but have said, these are different times. This is a different presidency. If Trump wasn't using these tactics, we wouldn't have to resort to these measures.
So given that it is being posed as such a dire measure, how do people in California feel about what's happening now?
Well, so internal polling that I have heard about, a lot of different groups, as well as Governor Newsom's team, were doing polling on this ahead of time to see where the voters would end up. And it appears that over 50%, they believe, will be behind this ballot measure. They think they can inch that number up higher once they really explain what's at stake here, because, of course, Democrats have overwhelming numbers in California. But, people from Republican districts really don't like it. And at the legislative committee hearings this week in Sacramento, there was a long line of people from more Republican areas of the state like Fresno and Bakersfield, Riverside, California, who lined up to say that there has been no transparency in this process, that this is not what the voters want. They also don't want more than $200 million of taxpayer money to be spent on this special election.
Wow.
And say that there's a lot, better things that money could be used for, especially at a time when California is having to make cuts to other essential services.
Of course, elections cost money. Yeah, something we haven't mentioned yet. But we have reported that Republicans in other states are considering changing their kind of district lines as well, in places like Florida and Indiana and Missouri, Ohio. Are there any other Democratic-led states that are thinking about kind of doing the same thing that California is and just going kind of tit for tat?
Other states certainly are talking about this. Illinois, for example, is one of the states that's looking at whether they could squeeze more Democratic seats out of their maps, which are already very gerrymandered. And, almost all of the seats in Illinois are Democratic controlled, but they were looking at whether they could potentially get one more seat out of their maps. New York is also looking at that as well, but they have some more constitutional and other hurdles. It has to be a multi-step process. So, it's likely that New York would not be able to get anything done before the 2026 midterm elections. And there are some other Democratic states looking at this, but nobody is as far along or as committed to this as California thus far.
Maeve, is this a fair fight? This kind of like tit for tat we're seeing between Republican and Democrat-controlled states, it feels like what you're saying is that Republican-led states can move much faster than Democrat-led states.
Yes, Republicans are considering changing district boundaries in states like Florida, Indiana, Missouri, and Ohio, even though some GOP lawmakers in those states have had reservations, and there are also maybe some legal hurdles in those states. But a lot of these Republican states just have made it easier to create Republican-leaning maps and don't have as many safeguards against that. So that's why Democrats in places like California have been arguing that this is not a fair fight and that they have essentially tied their own hands in their states with some of these measures to ensure that the maps are nonpartisan.
Just simply saying we're not going to take advantage of this, right? It's a philosophical thing they're talking about that they've tied their own hands with.
Yeah, and you have people like the former Attorney General, Eric Holder, who spearheaded a whole huge group to try to work toward independent redistricting and make this process less political. And even he is now, saying that the Democrats have been too hamstrung and that these are different times that call for different measures.
Maeve, if we're just kind of going back and forth with this, where different, a Republican-led state redraws the lines, a Democratic-led state redraws the lines, and it gets to the point, hypothetically, I guess, where even if you want to vote against redistricting and vote against gerrymandering, that your vote doesn't really matter because of how the lines have been drawn. Like, I feel like I'm having an existential crisis over this, but what happens in the long term when we start going down this road?
Well, I think that will be up to the voters of America to decide whether this is the kind of back and forth that they want, because a lot of people have described this as kind of a race to the bottom, including some of the people who have been involved with the Independent Redistricting Commission here in California, including former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, a Republican who championed it. And, he has argued that two wrongs don't make a right. And even went to the gym a morning a little while back with like a custom-made T-shirt that said gerrymandering is evil. And so there's a lot of different voices in this debate, and we're going to see that fought out over the next, I think it's 11 weeks here in California. It is going to be a hugely expensive campaign over this ballot measure, with both sides talking about raising more than $100 million to try to win this.
Wow.
The former Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy in Congress, who's now in the private sector, has said he'll be very involved in fundraising for the no side, fighting against the ballot measure. Governor Newsom, who has one of the best lists in politics, is going to be raising a ton of money on the yes side. And you've got groups from all over the country, partisan groups, that are going to get involved in this. And both sides are trying to frame this as a fight that has national consequences because it will potentially decide who controls Congress in 2026.
It's going to be a long 11 weeks.
It really is.
I'm sending you stamina, wishing stamina for you. Maeve, thank you so much for joining us, as you said, amidst a very, very busy year and a very busy couple of weeks here for you in California.
My pleasure.
Maeve Reston covers politics for The Post. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. There's a way now to dig in on the news that matters most to you and build a community around staying in the know. This is a way to level up your group chats. A premium subscription to The Washington Post now comes with 3 extra logins. You can give them to friends and family and dive in on stories together, chat about them, and get immediate access to the Post's exclusive stories. Check out the link in our show notes for details. You can also go to washingtonpost.com/subscribe. Again, that's washingtonpost.com/subscribe. Today's show was produced by Rennie Svirnovsky. It was edited by Rena Flores and mixed by Sam Baer. Thank you also to Thomas Liu, Molly Hennessy-Fisk, and Noah Bierman. I'm Ava Wallace. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.